This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together will comprise our lecture covering the article by Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich entitled Normativity and Epistemic Intuitions. Since we haven't encountered these authors before, the arc of the lecture will begin by introducing these authors through a brief biographical sketch. Afterward, the lecture then focuses upon articulating a basic version of analytic philosophy and its methodology. The goal here is to present a general strategy common not just to epistemology, but to analytic philosophy broadly that integrates the goals, the rationale, and the methodology oftentimes invoked by analytic philosophers. After which, we'll turn our attention specifically to intuition-driven romanticism and the four hypotheses about the nature of intuitions that the authors forward, discussing how those four hypotheses, if empirically validated, might serve to undermine the presuppositions of intuition-driven romanticism as outlined by the authors. After which, we'll focus on the data supporting the first and the second of those four hypotheses, and review the objections presented by the authors to their view together with their replies and defenses of their view in light of these objections. The lecture arc will come to completion when we take the material that we've encountered in this article and use it to revisit the Gettier cases and consider them in greater detail, dissecting the mechanisms through which Gettier cases attempt to establish their conclusion. Turning to the first portion of the lecture then, we'll begin with those introductory biographical sketches of Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich. We'll discuss the basic methodology, rationale, and goals of analytic philosophy, and then introduce intuition-driven romanticism as outlined in the paper, together with the four hypotheses about intuitions that the authors forward. The first hypothesis suggests that the typical intuition elicited by a thought experiment may vary from one culture to the next. The second hypothesis asserts that the typical intuition elicited by a thought experiment may vary from one socioeconomic group to the next. The third hypothesis asserts that variation may be associated with differences in philosophical training. And the fourth hypothesis suggests that variations in the typical intuition elicited by a thought experiment may be affected by elements of the presentation of that experiment that are epistemically irrelevant, such things as the order in which the thought experiments are presented to a subject. Our first author is Dr. Jonathan Weinberg. Dr. Weinberg received a BA from Harvard in 1994 and a PhD from Rutgers in 2001. Stephen Stich was his PhD director. He's currently a professor of philosophy at the University of Arizona. Dr. Sean Nichols received his BA from Stanford in 1986 and his PhD from Rutgers in 1992. Like Jonathan Weinberg, Sean Nichols was a Stich student. He's currently a full professor in the philosophy department at Cornell University. He's written 2 books, including Sentimental Rules on the Natural Foundations of Moral Judgment, which he published in 2004. He's also edited 3 volumes, including a volume on experimental philosophy that was published in 2008. Our third and final author is Dr. Stephen Stich. Dr. Stich received a BA from the University of Pennsylvania in 1964 and a PhD from Princeton in 1968. He's currently on the Board of Regents for Rutgers, as well as a member of the Philosophy Department and the Center for Cognitive Science. When people write the history of 20th century philosophy, I suspect that Stich will be noted both for his philosophical contributions and for the many talented philosophers for whom he's played a mentoring role. The approach to epistemology targeted by Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich in their paper has its origins in analytic philosophy of the 20th century. As you know, analytic philosophy emerged in the early part of the 20th century to become the dominant school of philosophy by mid-century. At that time, if you were to ask somebody like Roderick Chisholm why they practice philosophy in the way that they do, they might tell you some story along these lines. Our ordinary concepts, as well as the terms of our natural language, correspond to and pick out real kinds in the world. For instance, the concepts of love or justice and knowledge, when carefully and thoughtfully applied, will pick out all and only the instances of love and justice and knowledge in the world. Our concepts are so facile at categorization precisely because they implicitly contain the necessary and sufficient conditions for kind membership. Our concepts inform our use of the corresponding terms in our language, thereby helping our language to have a similar uniform facility. However, we have no conscious access to these conceptual definitions for the purposes of theorizing about the nature of these kinds. Thus, the job of philosophers is to make this implicit knowledge explicit. Now, how might they go about doing that? Well, to discover the necessary and sufficient conditions implicitly structuring our concepts and guiding our categorization behavior, as well as giving meaning to the terms corresponding to those concepts in our natural language, philosophers use thought experiments to elicit intuitions. Since our concepts inform these intuitions, philosophers then use these intuitive verdicts to craft definitions, recreating the necessary and sufficient conditions implicit in our concepts. Ultimately, then, philosophers trace the outlines of our concepts indirectly through their analysis of our intuitive categorization judgments about thought experiments. Now, not everyone, even people who are instrumental in the development of analytic philosophy, buy into this view even during the 20th century. For instance, Wittgenstein famously rejects this view. In the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention specifically to intuition-driven romanticism as characterized by Weinberg, Nichols, and Stich in their paper.